Ursula Herrmann was born on the 24th of November 1970 in Bavaria, Germany, and lived in Eching am Ammersee in Bavaria with her parents and 3 siblings, 2 older brothers, Michael and Hans, and an older sister. Ursula was described by her family and friends as intelligent and energetic, who loved the arts, more specifically singing and painting, and gymnastics, a sport she adored and attended classes for. On the 15th of September 1981, 10-year-old Ursula spent the day at high school in Landsberg. It was the first day of term and her first day of secondary school, a huge step for many of us growing up. Little did she know that her first day there would also be her last. After finishing school that day, Ursula returned home to practice piano with her 18-year-old brother, Michael. At approximately 5 p.m, Ursula, who was the youngest of the Herrmann children, left the family home in Eching and cycled to Schöndorf to attend a gymnastics lesson with her cousin, travelling through a wooded area and a lake path to get there. This particular area of brush, which was commonly known as Weingarten, was popular for hunters, dog walkers, joggers and cyclists, as well as some students from the nearby boarding school. Following the gymnastics class, Ursula was meant to return home. However, the 10-year-old decided to go back to her cousin's house in Schöndorf am Ammersee, located around a mile or so away from Eching, where she spent some time with her cousin and stayed for dinner. Ursula's father, who worked as a high school teacher, called her uncle shortly afterwards at 7:20 p.m. and informed Ursula that her father had asked her to return home as night would fall soon. Ursula left her cousin's home immediately at approximately 7:25 p.m, jumping on her red bike and riding through the Weingarten woods back to the Herrmann residence. However, Ursula never made it home. Somewhere along the forest track, within 10 minutes it would have taken to get home, Ursula Herrmann disappeared. Around half an hour passed, and Ursula still wasn't home. Her family were growing increasingly concerned, as she was never late for anything, so they contacted her aunt and uncle again to ask of Ursula's whereabouts, but they told the Herrmanns that the 10-year-old had left their residence 25 minutes prior. This was a huge red flag for Ursula's parents. They knew in their hearts that something was awry. As a result, Ursula's father and uncle ventured out into the forest, connecting Eching and Schöndorf, their cars meeting in the centre at around 8 p.m, and the two went out looking for the schoolgirl, calling out her name, but all they met with was an eerie silence. Shortly afterwards, family, friends, neighbours, police and local firemen joined the search, torches in hand, scouring the dark woods and the lake shores for any sign of Ursula. The pitch black and heavy rain made it difficult for the search party to thoroughly explore the dense brush. At approximately 11:15 p.m, a police dog led their handler away from the lake towards some overgrowth, and just a few metres away from the path, they made a startling discovery. Laying on the ground, hidden within the brush, was Ursula Herrmann's red bike, but she was nowhere to be seen. The search for Ursula continued into the night and through into the following morning, with divers going into the lake to look for the young girl. For a child to go missing in Eching was extremely rare, so it wasn't long before local media and radio stations got wind of Ursula's disappearance. Radio stations appealed to the public for information the following morning after the schoolgirl's disappearance, but nothing of significance was called in. The search for Ursula continued in the following days. However, 2 days later, on September 17th, the case took a sinister turn. Whilst awaiting any news, the Herrmanns received a chilling number of phone calls from an anonymous person via payphone. Upon picking up the phone, the Herrmanns were met with silence on the caller's end, followed by a 3-second jingle from the traffic bulletin on the Bairn 3 radio station, followed by more silence and the jingle playing once again, before the caller abruptly hung up. The cryptic and disturbing phone calls continued a further 3 times that same day, with some of the latter calls being monitored by authorities. The following day, on September 18th, Mr. Herrmann received a letter in the post marked urgent. However, upon opening the letter, the Herrmanns were left shaken. It was a ransom note, composed using cut-out letters from newspaper articles. The ransom note itself was extremely odd, considering the Herrmanns were not a wealthy family by any means. They had a nice home by the lake, but the land it was built on was inherited from earlier relatives. The letter, which was written in broken German, claimed that the unknown person or persons had kidnapped Ursula, and that if the Herrmanns ever wanted to see their daughter alive again, they would have to pay approximately 2 million Deutschmarks as a ransom. The note also went on to explain the perpetrator's cryptic phone calls, stating that the jingle was their so-called call sign, and that all they wanted was to hear from the Herrmanns after the jingle sounded, whether they agreed to the ransom demands or not. But of course, the note came a day after the initial calls, waiting for the Herrmanns' response. The note also demanded that the police were not to be involved, and that if they were, or the Herrmanns did not agree to the kidnappers' terms, they would kill 10-year-old Ursula. A short while later, the phone rang again, and it was the same jingle that sounded on the caller's end. Mrs. Herrmann told her daughter's abductor that she agreed to their terms, but she demanded proof that her daughter was still alive. But the caller didn't answer and hung up. They never called again. However, a second ransom note was delivered to the Herrmann property on Monday the 21st of September, which detailed how the ransom money was to be paid. The money had to be paid in 100 Deutschmark bills and had to be put into a suitcase before being delivered to an unknown drop-off point by Mr. Herrmann in a Fiat 600, a car which was rather rare in Germany at the time. The Herrmanns, as previously mentioned, were not a particularly well-off family, but a neighbour managed to raise some of the ransom money, and the state apparently agreed to pay the remainder. The Herrmanns waited for 2 weeks for any further word from their daughter's alleged abductor, but they didn't receive any calls or any letters. Police were left with very few leads at this point. As a result, authorities decided to scour the forest again to search for any clues, splitting off into 4 groups to carry out thorough grid searches. On October 4th at 9:30 a.m, approximately 19 days after Ursula vanished, a police officer struck something solid in amongst some soil on the forest floor, around 800 metres away from the lake path. After alerting another officer, the two wiped away some leaves and broke a thin layer of clay, only to discover a blanket covering a wooden board. Initially, the pair thought they had found an underground arms depot, but this was far from the case. The police officers lifted the board and discovered a second wooden board, which appeared to be the lid of a box, which was painted aquamarine in colour and bolted shut. One of the officers grabbed a spade and destroyed the bolts. He then opened the 60-kilogram box, which measured 72 by 60 by 149 centimetres, and was buried approximately 1.4 metres deep, and the officer was horrified by what he found inside. Sitting at the bottom of the box was a lifeless Ursula Herrmann, her head tilted back and her eyes closed. She was dead. Inside the small, compact box was a seat that doubled as a toilet seat with a hole cut in the middle of it and a bucket full of water sitting underneath. In front of the seat was a board which acted as a desk, which had a light and a small battery-operated radio sitting on it, set on the Bairn 3 radio station, the same station where the jingle came from in the cryptic phone calls to the Herrmanns. When Ursula was found, she also had a bag which contained a tracksuit resting up against her leg, and she was leaning against another bag which contained a blanket. A drainage pipe ventilation system was also installed within the confines of the box, which did go up to ground level, but there was no way for the air within the box to circulate. Therefore, oxygen would have run out within a short amount of time. Ursula's abductor failed to recognise this issue, which led some to believe that the kidnapper didn't necessarily intend for the schoolgirl to die. Also within the box were 3 bottles of water, 12 cans of Fanta, a carton of apple juice, 4 packets of Butterkeks biscuits, 4 bars of Milka chocolate, 2 bars of Ritter Sport chocolate, 2 packs of Juicy Fruit chewing gum, and a collection of 21 books, all of which appeared to have been untouched. The police also later found a copper wire, which hung in the nearby trees, although it took them over a year to discover that the bell wire acted as an alert system for when the abduction was taking place, with presumably one of the kidnappers waiting for their victim whilst the other was acting as a lookout. Police only discovered this information following a visit to a nearby boarding school, where 2 students told them that they had found the wire one night whilst chasing an owl through the woods. Since that night, it had been kept locked in a box in the student dormitory. After an agonising 19 days of no news, the Herrmanns were informed that their daughter's body had been found, hidden in a box, buried beneath the forest floor. They were understandably devastated by the news, so much so that Ursula's mother couldn't face anyone. But Mr. Herrmann kept asking police if his daughter had been hurt prior to her death, but she hadn't. After her body was recovered from the underground prison, Ursula's body was sent to Munich for an autopsy, which revealed she had suffocated due to poor ventilation within the box, and had died between 30 minutes and 5 hours after being placed inside it. There were no signs of a struggle, nor any indication for that matter that Ursula had moved at all after being placed inside the box, such as any scratch marks on the material lining of the wall of the box, suggesting Ursula tried to free herself or call for help, leading authorities to believe that she may have been drugged prior to her death, quite possibly with nitrous oxide, as no drugs were found in her system, nor were there any needle marks on her skin. The medical examiner also found that Ursula had 2 discoloured stains on either side of her larynx, but this was not explored any further by pathologists, for reasons unknown. As police went on the hunt for her killer, Ursula was laid to rest a few days later in her hometown of Eching. Her family were heartbroken, and the local community were shaken to the core. Children who were once able to roam Eching without care were no longer safe. A killer was out there, and as a result, parents wouldn't let their children out of their sights. As the town mourned for Ursula, the hunt for the killer continued. With the box weighing approximately 60 kilograms, authorities concluded it would have been impossible for one person to have placed it in the woods without some sort of assistance, therefore looked into the possibility that more than one person was involved in Ursula's abduction and subsequent death. A fingerprint was found on some duct tape, but despite taking thousands of fingerprints from locals, no match was found. Police appealed once again to the public for information, offering a 30,000 Deutschmark reward for anyone who could lead authorities to Ursula's killer. Hundreds upon hundreds of tips came in, and one name continued to crop up: Werner Mazurek, a 31-year-old television repairman and neighbour of the Herrmanns, who was in thousands of Deutschmarks in debt. Mazurek was questioned at the time of Ursula's disappearance. However, he provided an alibi, stating that he was home playing a board game with his wife and two of their friends. Police also searched Mazurek's property, including a workshop, and even arrested him in early 1982, questioning him for a number of days. But without any forensic proof that he was involved, his fingerprints did not match the one on the duct tape, for example, authorities had no choice but to release him. A short while afterwards, Mazurek moved away from Eching, something which the locals rejoiced in. Mazurek was not a well-liked man, even before this crime took place. Rather interestingly, around 4 weeks later, the landlord of an unemployed mechanic and acquaintance of Mazurek, Klaus Pfaffinger, told police that a few weeks prior to the crime, he saw Klaus Pfaffinger drive a moped with a spade attached to the side, which the landlord found a little suspicious. Klaus initially denied being involved in any crime, but on the second day of interrogation, he admitted that in early September of 1981, Werner Mazurek asked him to dig a hole in the woods for 1,000 Deutschmarks and a television. Klaus then admitted to later seeing the hole filled with a box. When taken to the forest, however, Klaus failed to locate the spot and retracted his confession. Because of this, Pfaffinger was released without charge. Following these dead-end leads, the case quickly went cold. In 2005, however, the case was reopened after investigators wanted to carry out DNA analysis on the ransom notes, a number of items from the crime scene, and some hairs found inside the box. However, the results revealed that the hairs belonged to a forensic technician who had been working on the case at the time. The DNA found did help create a number of profiles, one of which actually linked to another brutal murder of garage owner Charlotte Boehringer in Munich in 2006. However, it was believed that the DNA sample was contaminated, as Charlotte's killer, her nephew, was only a few years old at the time of Ursula's murder. Authorities could not investigate further into Klaus Pfaffinger during the reopened investigation, as he passed away in the 1990s, but authorities still believed that Klaus's initial statement regarding digging a hole for Mazurek was true. He had specific details in his statement which only someone who took part in the crime would have known, such as the box's dimensions, although it is alleged that Klaus got this information from press publications. Following the crime, authorities did make a number of errors, including not cordoning the crime scene off. Anyone could have visited the scene and seen where the box was buried, what it looked like, etc. Klaus could have easily visited the crime scene after Ursula was found, or he could have heard the details from an acquaintance. How Klaus knew these details remains unknown. Surveillance was then carried out on Werner Mazurek in 2007, which included the likes of an undercover police officer, bugs in Mazurek's car, and even tapping his phone, which allegedly revealed that he had exchanged a phone call with a friend in which the pair discussed the statute of limitations in the Ursula Herrmann case. Due to the case being reopened, public interest increased once again. Many wondered if authorities had perhaps found something of significance with the aforementioned DNA samples, but others speculated that they were probably re-examining the case due to the 30-year statute of limitations for kidnapping with fatal consequences nearing its end. Authorities managed to obtain a saliva sample from Mazurek, but no match to the crime scene was found. Investigators then searched Mazurek's home for a second time, and it was during this search that investigators discovered a tape recorder with audio abnormalities, which was later handed over to Bavarian police. Experts specialising in phonetics concluded, after analysing the audio footage on the tape, that this tape recorder was likely used to record and play the Bayern 3 radio station jingle over the phone to the Herrmanns. This was widely criticised, but it was deemed enough to implicate Werner Mazurek, despite his denial of any involvement in the crime and no forensic evidence whatsoever linking him to the crime scene, no DNA or fingerprint evidence. All evidence against Mazurek was purely circumstantial, but for authorities, that was enough. Mazurek was arrested in May of 2008, where he subsequently was put on trial for extortionist robbery with fatal consequences. His wife was also put on trial for being an accessory to the crime. The trial began in February of 2009, and the prosecution had absolutely no difficulty in finding witnesses who confirmed Mazurek's poor character, including members of his own family. He was a short-tempered individual who was not very well liked. According to an article on The Guardian, he had previous run-ins with the law regarding fraud, and in 1974 even carried out a despicable act of animal cruelty against the family dog, who he placed in a freezer after the dog knocked over a trash can, the animal subsequently freezing to death. Something else which did not go in Mazurek's favour was that he was in a humongous amount of debt, totalling over 140,000 marks, the prosecution stating that this was motive enough for Mazurek to commit such a despicable crime. The prosecution also stated that Werner had the woodworking skills to make the box itself in his workshop. Quite interestingly, the prosecution stood by Klaus Pfaffinger's initial confession about digging the hole for Mazurek, citing that this was credible evidence, as many of the details given in Klaus's statement were proven to be remarkably accurate, such as the exact dimensions of the hole. But the statement was never actually signed and was written weeks after Klaus supposedly confessed, written down by an officer purely from memory. The other piece of important yet controversial evidence presented at the trial was, of course, the Grundig model TK248 tape recorder. The audio abnormalities from the tape recorder were heard in the jingle given over the phone to the Herrmanns. According to an audio expert, there was little doubt that it was the same recording device used. The defence stated that Mazurek had told authorities that he had bought the tape recorder at a flea market a week prior to his house being raided by police, but who he supposedly purchased the device from is unknown, as the seller could not be traced. Many sellers at the market were questioned, but nobody could recall selling a tape recorder. The Herrmanns did not want to face their traumatic ordeal all over again at the trial. However, Ursula's brother Michael agreed to attend as co-plaintiff. By this time, Michael was 45 years old and was a music and religious high school teacher. He was understandably desperate for answers, as were the entire family, and he wanted justice to prevail for his little sister. Prior to the trial, Michael was granted access to all of the case files, and despite the evidence against Mazurek, Michael couldn't help but feel that there was more to be uncovered. He couldn't understand why Klaus Pfaffinger's confession was now being treated as gospel when it had been dismissed many years beforehand. Klaus was a very heavy drinker and reportedly extremely lazy, with his wife saying that he would never have dug a hole in the woods. Klaus didn't work because he simply couldn't be bothered to, so why would he have bothered helping Mazurek? Neither of the men's DNA or fingerprints were found at the scene either, with Klaus's remains being exhumed to confirm this. To Michael, so much about this case didn't make sense. With his extensive knowledge in sound engineering, Michael couldn't see how the tape recorder could definitively be linked to the phone calls, despite the tape recorder being analysed by an expert. As a result, Michael wrote a letter to the court, explaining that he believed the sound expert's report regarding the tape recordings were, quote, incomplete or one-sided. This was obviously very shocking, that the victim's brother was actually siding with the defence, but Michael did not believe that Mazurek was 100% guilty of these crimes. Throughout his life, Michael has wanted answers, but only the truth. Michael wanted to make sure that the right person paid the price for his sister's death. After an agonising 55-day trial in 2009, 28 years after the death of Ursula Herrmann, Werner Mazurek was found guilty of extortionist human robbery resulting in death by 3 judges and 2 jurors. On the 25th of March 2010, Mazurek was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes. However, his wife was acquitted due to lack of evidence. In 2013, Michael Herrmann brought a civil case against the accused Werner Mazurek, demanding compensation of 40,000 marks. Michael suffered from tinnitus as a result of severe stress from the criminal case and subsequent trial. The case consumed Michael so much that he was glued to the case files for hours every night, trying to make sense of it all. As a result of this, his marriage suffered, and not long afterwards, he and his wife went their separate ways. The case went to trial once more in 2016, and legal proceedings lasted for over 2 years. Mazurek would go on to use the defence that he was wrongly convicted, therefore could not be held liable for Michael's tinnitus. This meant that all of the facts in the Ursula Herrmann case had to be looked at once again. Evidence which debunked the tape recorder analysis was presented to the court, as was further analysis of the ransom notes, which concluded that the author of the letters was German, but they were pretending to be a foreigner. Remember, the letters were written in broken German. It was concluded following detailed analysis that these letters could not have been written by Werner Mazurek. On the 2nd of August 2018, the court gave their final verdict. Mazurek was ordered to pay Michael Herrmann approximately 14,000 marks in damages, but the conviction against Mazurek still stood. The court still firmly believed that Mazurek was responsible for the kidnap and death of Ursula Herrmann, and therefore his life sentence still stood. In May of 2019, Michael presented further evidence to the court, firstly regarding the Fiat 600 as expressed in the ransom note, which demanded their father drive the rare car to a drop-off point. The same car was drawn in one of the comic books located within the box, making it seem as if the perpetrator had read the same comic. The broken German in these ransom notes letters meant that it could have been written by someone of a lower education, such as a student, but this was dismissed, despite this theory being entirely possible. Michael also presented evidence regarding mathematical scrawlings on one of the ransom notes, suggesting that someone at the boarding school perhaps was involved, since many students knew the forest well. Interestingly, the students' fingerprints were never taken in regards to this case. But despite the court hearing the evidence presented to them, they concluded that this evidence wasn't enough to reopen the case. The Herrmann family took a long time to come to terms with the loss of Ursula, and in the years that followed, tried their hardest to not let the search for their daughter's killer consume them. The Herrmanns never talk about Ursula in public, other than Michael, in pursuit for the truth, but they reportedly all support what he's doing. To this day, it remains unclear who truly abducted Ursula Herrmann. We don't know how Ursula came to be buried in the box in the woods. Was she carried there? Was she drugged whilst on a nearby path? Lured? If so, how were the drugs used, obtained? A lot in this case still remains unanswered. Was Werner Mazurek guilty? If not, who was responsible for the death of Ursula Herrmann? Ursula was a bright young girl, taken in the prime of her life in the most horrific way. If she was conscious within the box following her abduction, it's difficult to imagine how terrified she must have been. We can only hope that with the passage of time, the Herrmanns can heal from their terrible loss, and that someday they will find justice and closure. They have never forgotten the energetic yet sensitive 10-year-old, and many Germans today still remember the tragic case of the so-called girl in the box. Ursula's memory certainly lives on in the minds and hearts of those who loved her the most. She will most certainly never be forgotten.